Chapter 1. A World on the Brink. In the heart of the second millennium BCE, the Near East pulsed with ambition and tension. This was not merely a region. It was a crossroads of civilization, where powerful kingdoms and restless city-states collided in a constant struggle for supremacy. The rivers of Mesopotamia nourished the empires of Babylon and Assyria, while further west, the rugged hills of Canaan bore witness to a different kind of conflict, one rooted in resistance, trade, and the fragile politics of survival. The land was not yet carved into fixed borders. Instead, it moved like shifting sands under the weight of empires. At this time, the idea of empire was still evolving. Power did not always come from conquest alone, but through influence, trade, and strategic diplomacy. The ancient kingdoms of Mesopotamia held sway through a combination of military prowess and cultural dominance. Their cities glimmered with wealth accumulated from trade routes stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean. But the balance of power was precarious, often threatened by internal upheaval or the ambitions of emerging rivals. To the west, Egypt stood as a jewel carved from the banks of the Nile. It had risen from its own turbulent history to become a unified and thriving civilization. Its pharaohs were gods in flesh, ruling through divine mandate, and their reach extended far beyond the desert sands. Under the 18th dynasty, a lineage that would come to define Egyptian greatness, the kingdom looked outward with new hunger. No longer content to rule the fertile valley alone, Egypt now cast its gaze across the deserts and seas, toward Canaan and the wealth of the Levant. Canaan itself was a region unlike any other. Neither fully independent nor completely dominated, it was a patchwork of fortified city-states, each with its own ruler, customs, and ambitions. These cities, Hazor, Kadesh, Megiddo, thrived on trade, acting as vital arteries through which the riches of the ancient world flowed. From the mountains of Lebanon came prized cedar wood. From Arabia, incense and myrrh. From the mines of Sinai, turquoise and copper. Control over Canaan meant control over the economic lifeblood of multiple civilizations. But this region was more than just a trade hub. It was a diplomatic battleground. The princes of Canaan played a dangerous game, caught between great powers. At times, they paid tribute to Egypt. At others, they sought alliances with Babylon, Mitanni, or even the distant Hittites. Their allegiance was fluid, dictated by fear, greed, and the ever-shifting winds of regional politics. This delicate balance was both a shield and a curse. It gave them leverage, but it also made them vulnerable to being crushed by whichever empire grew impatient first. Egypt's interest in Canaan was not simply driven by ambition, it was driven by necessity. The Nile, while generous, was not infinite. Egypt's prosperity depended on imports: timber for boats and buildings, lapis lazuli for jewelry, horses for its chariots. A disruption in trade could weaken not just the economy but the power of the throne itself. Pharaohs understood this well, and their military campaigns were as much about protecting commerce as they were about expanding borders. By the time Thutmos III emerged as heir to the Egyptian throne, the situation in Canaan had become dangerously unstable. City-states once compliant now bristled with defiance. Princes who had once bowed to Egypt's governors whispered of rebellion in shadowed halls. Some hoped to throw off the burden of tribute. Others sought to claim independence and carve out their own dominions. The signs of unrest were too many to ignore. Far to the north, the Mitanni Empire watched closely. These masters of chariot warfare, based in what is now northern Syria, had their own designs on the region. Though Egypt and Mitanni avoided direct confrontation during this period, both understood that Canaan was the key to controlling the eastern Mediterranean. As local rulers in Canaan grew restless, whispers of Mitanni support reached the ears of Egyptian spies. Egypt's grip was loosening, and Thutmos III was about to tighten it again. The roads of Canaan, paved by centuries of trade and blood, became lines of fracture. Caravans moved under increasing threat. Banditry, once sporadic, now flourished as cities armed themselves against each other and against Egyptian patrols. tribute caravans destined for Thebes began to disappear. Governors reported uprisings, attacks on outposts, and growing defiance from cities that had once served as loyal vassals. The land that had once bowed its head to Egypt now threatened to rise in unison against it. Amid this unrest, Megiddo began to emerge as the nexus of rebellion. More than a fortress, it was a symbol. Its walls a statement of Canaanite resilience, its location a gateway between north and south, east and west. Whoever held Megiddo could choke the arteries of Egyptian trade and slice through the fragile network of alliances that held Canaan in check. The city's leaders, emboldened by growing support, prepared for what they believed could be a new era of Canaanite independence. Thutmos III, young but already battle-hardened, saw in this moment the chance to carve his name into eternity. No longer under the shadow of Hatshepsut, he now ruled alone. But legitimacy in Egypt was a delicate thing, especially after the co-regency. Victory in Canaan would not only quell rebellion but establish his place among the warrior kings of old. The murmurs of revolt were a summons, one he could not afford to ignore. The diplomatic web that once connected Egypt to Canaan began to fray. Messages from loyal governors turned increasingly desperate. Requests for reinforcements became pleas for survival. Cities once aligned with Egypt began to hedge their bets, seeking terms with both sides. A power vacuum was forming, and if Egypt did not act, it would be filled by its rivals. For Thutmos III, the time for treaties had passed. The march to Megiddo was not a choice, it was an imperative. The air in Thebes grew thick with preparations. Priests consulted omens, generals reviewed maps, scribes recorded declarations of loyalty. Beneath the golden sun of the Nile, an army began to take shape, one that would soon cross deserts and mountains to make war in the name of Egypt's divine order. The rebellion in Canaan would not be settled in backrooms or with bribes. It would be settled with steel and fire. And so the stage was set. The wealth of nations, the pride of princes, and the future of an empire all hung in the balance. The world was not yet aware that it stood on the brink of the first great battle recorded in history. But soon, Megiddo would no longer be a name whispered in fear. It would be etched in stone and memory. Forever. Chapter 2. The warrior-pharaoh in waiting. In the great palace of Thebes, where stone columns soared like trees and sunlight filtered through painted ceilings, a boy named Thutmos learned to walk not just as a prince, but as a god in waiting. Born into the ruling house of Egypt's 18th dynasty, Thutmos III carried the blood of conquerors. His grandfather, Thutmos I, had driven the Egyptian army deep into Nubia and Syria. His father, Thutmos II, had continued those conquests. Yet, fate placed a strange twist upon the shoulders of this royal child. His path to power would be anything but direct. Upon the death of Thutmos II, the kingdom did not pass smoothly into the boy's hands. Instead, his stepmother and aunt, the formidable Hatshepsut, stepped into the void and seized the throne. She was no mere regent. She crowned herself pharaoh, wearing the ceremonial beard and ruling not in the boy's name, but in her own. While Hatshepsut cloaked her reign in religious legitimacy, claiming the favor of Ammonius, young Thutmos watched from the shadows as Egypt prospered under a queen who defied tradition. But even in those years of co-regency, Thutmos was not idle. Though sidelined in politics, he was honed like a blade in the art of war. His education was entrusted to Egypt's most seasoned warriors, veterans of campaigns in Nubia and the Sinai. He trained daily in the art of the composite bow, learned to ride and command the swift Egyptian chariot, and practiced the tactics of ambush, flanking, and siegecraft. Battle was not merely taught to him, it was instilled as identity. While Hatshepsut focused on diplomacy and monument building, favoring trade over conquest, the young prince absorbed every report of unrest in the empire's frontiers. He watched with interest as Canaanite princes pushed against Egypt's grip and as Mitanni maneuvered for dominance in the north. In the quiet corners of his chambers, He studied the failures of past kings, and dreamed of victories his guardians dared not yet let him chase. There was something else that war could offer him: vindication. Though his royal blood was never in doubt, Thutmos III had been robbed of his early reign. Hatshepsut's long and successful rule cast a long shadow. To some in the court, the boy remained a footnote to her legacy, a prince who had missed his chance. But he would change that. He would reclaim his name not with temples or treaties, but with the roar of chariots and the burning of enemy banners. His tutors reminded him that war was not simply a clash of weapons. It was a divine performance. The pharaoh was not just a king but Horus incarnate, the living god who maintained Ma'at, the sacred balance. Each battle, each march was not only for territory but for the cosmos. Victory proved divine favor. Defeat threatened cosmic chaos. Thutmose absorbed this deeply. His campaign would not just be personal, it would be sacred. In the war chambers of Karnak, he studied past campaigns, not as legends but as blueprints. He knew the geography of the Levant like a merchant, where the roads bent around hills, where the water flowed, where a column of troops could disappear into ambush. He traced the old Horus road through Gaza, imagined his banners flying there. He read dispatches from border garrisons and plotted what he would do differently. His mind was a battlefield long before he set foot on one. By the time Hatshepsut died and he finally stood alone as pharaoh, Thutmose III was not an untested youth. He was a coiled spring waiting for release. He inherited a stable Egypt, well-fed, well-organized, and with armies at his command. But he saw not peace but opportunity. While others saw the Nile's calm, he envisioned the thunder of hooves across the hills of Canaan. His coronation was marked not just with gold but with oaths. Nobles swore fealty, priests chanted blessings, and the gods were summoned to witness his rise. But beneath the sacred incense and soft music, there pulsed a tension. Would he rule as Hatshepsut had, prudent and patient, or would he cut a new path forged in steel? The answer came swiftly. Reports from Canaan spoke of rebellion. Cities delayed their tribute. Roads grew unsafe. The moment had arrived. Thutmose III did not flinch. He summoned his generals, reviewed supply lines, and issued the call for muster. Across Egypt, messengers galloped to outposts, summoning archers, charioteers, and engineers. From Nubia came dark-skinned warriors with deadly bows. From the Delta came swift horsemen and scouts. From the workshops of Memphis came bronze blades and armor gleaming like sunlight. Egypt's war machine, long dormant, awakened under his command. Even as the preparations began, the pharaoh visited temples and made offerings. In the sanctuaries of Amonia-Sare, he asked not just for strength, but for clarity. His army would march with the gods at its side or not at all. Omens were read. The stars studied. The oracles spoke favorably. The gods would bless this campaign. The warrior-pharaoh would march. Among his courtiers, excitement surged. This was not a ruler who feared conflict. This was the grandson of conquerors, and he would surpass them. He would not merely suppress revolt, he would make an example. His chariots would thunder through the valleys of Canaan, and every prince who doubted Egypt's reach would be brought to heel. There would be no compromise, only conquest. Yet for all his power, Thutmose III understood the weight of war. He did not charge blindly. His strategies were precise, his logistics sound, his leadership deliberate. He knew that in the tangled politics of Canaan, alliances could shift like wind in the desert. Victory would depend not just on arms, but on timing, patience, and the mastery of terrain. He would fight as a general, but win as a tactician. As the Nile rose and blessed the fields with life, Thutmose III prepared to sow a different seed, one of discipline, terror, and dominance. He was no longer the child of co-regency. He was pharaoh now, and the world would soon remember his name. Megiddo awaited. Chapter 3, The Canaanite Storm. In the hilly, sun-baked lands of Canaan, a different storm brewed. One not of thunder and rain, but of tension, ambition, and rebellion. These were lands straddling empire, crossroads of wealth and conflict. Each city-state, from Kadesh to Hazor to the mighty Megiddo, carried its own ambitions like a torch, and now those ambitions were catching fire. The Canaanite princes, once bound by tribute and fear to Egypt, now began whispering of independence in the same breath as war. Megiddo, perched upon its windswept promontory, loomed like a sentinel over the routes of power. To its east and west flowed the arteries of commerce, routes that carried cedar from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and spices from Arabia. It was more than a fortress. It was the beating heart of Canaanite defiance. Beneath its thick mud-brick walls, emissaries from nearby cities met in secret, weighed risks, and envisioned a world without Egypt's shadow stretching over their gates. Their grievances were long-standing. Egypt's governors imposed tribute like clockwork, grain, metals, horses, even children conscripted as hostages to guarantee obedience. Local rulers, forced to serve foreign interests, found themselves increasingly estranged from their own people. Pride, that oldest of provocations, simmered beneath layers of protocol. Now, emboldened by Egypt's recent silence and the recent death of Hatshepsut, many believed the time had come to cast off the golden yoke. Yet rebellion in Canaan was not born only of resentment, it was also born of opportunity. The kingdom of Mitanni, to the north, had grown wary of Egypt's expansion. Though the two empires had not clashed directly, Mitanni had begun to nurture uprisings in Egypt's periphery, offering quiet support to Canaanite rulers in exchange for future allegiance. The princes knew this. They hoped that if Egypt did move to crush them, Mitanni might intervene, or at least force Egypt to divide its forces. Some among them remembered Thutmos I and his distant campaigns in Syria. But those were distant memories, the pharaohs of a different generation. The young Thutmos III, to them, was untested. Some even thought him weak, a man raised under a woman's shadow, shaped by courts rather than campaigns. They underestimated him. In their minds, the timing was perfect. Egypt's chariots had not darkened their horizons in years. Now was their chance to rewrite the order of the world. And so the alliances formed. At Kadesh, envoys signed secret pacts. At Megiddo, war councils were held beneath torchlight. Messages were sent across valleys and mountaintops, urging neighboring rulers to rise. Some hesitated, fearful of Egypt's wrath. Others responded eagerly, driven by revenge, greed, or desperation. What emerged was not a formal army, but a patchwork coalition, united not by structure but by a shared dream of defiance. The geography of Canaan favored rebellion. The land's fractured terrain, its jagged ridges, winding passes, and fortified cities, made rapid conquest nearly impossible. Each stronghold could become a miniature war. Each valley could hide ambushes. The rebels knew their lands better than any foreign general ever could. It was this familiarity, this intimacy with the soil, that gave them hope. Let the pharaoh come. The land itself would rise to resist him. They began preparing defenses. Stores were stocked, walls were repaired, and secret paths between towns were mapped and memorized. In Megiddo, the greatest effort was made. Its gates were reinforced, towers manned day and night, and surrounding fields stripped bare to deny the enemy supplies. If Egypt meant to reclaim Canaan, it would pay dearly, brick by brick, man by man. But rebellion comes at a cost. Not all cities joined the cause. Some remained loyal to Egypt, either out of fear or profit. These cities became targets. Spies were sent to destabilize them, and their governors were harassed or assassinated. Civil strife crept through the land. Canaan was no longer just a land of cities. It had become a land of sides. The lines were drawn not on maps, but in hearts. Thutmos III received news of these developments not with surprise, but with intent. He had anticipated the rebellion, perhaps even welcomed it. Now he had cause to act. His scribes brought him reports of tribute withheld, governors fleeing for their lives, and caravan routes attacked. For the young pharaoh, this was not a moment of crisis, it was a moment of opportunity. The time had come to turn potential into proof. As preparations began in Thebes, the Canaanite coalition finalized its own plans. They expected Egypt to come along predictable paths, the wide coastal roads, the fertile valleys. There, they would meet them, force a drawn-out campaign, wear them down. They underestimated Egypt's hunger for surprise, for speed, for audacity. They believed the battle would be theirs to choose. Inside Megiddo, confidence swelled. Scouts were posted to monitor the south. Messengers were dispatched to rally stragglers to their cause. The city's ruler, seated atop a throne not as lavish as a pharaoh's, nonetheless felt the pull of destiny. If Megiddo held, if Egypt was turned back, the entire balance of power in the Near East could change. They did not know it yet, but they stood on the precipice of legend or ruin. Amid this rising tension, there was no going back. Too many oaths had been sworn. Too many rivals joined in uneasy alliance. What began as whispers had become declarations. What started as discontent had become open defiance. The storm had gathered. The skies above Canaan darkened, not with clouds, but with war. In every temple from Hazor to Lachish, priests prayed to their gods for protection. Warriors sharpened their blades, and fathers kissed their sons before sending them to fight. The old world, held loosely by tribute and tolerance, was slipping away. A new age was coming, one that would be shaped by bronze and blood, and forever remembered at the gates of Megiddo. Chapter 4: March of the Empire. The silence before a campaign in Egypt was not an absence of sound. It was a hum beneath the surface, 1,000 hands preparing, 1,000 minds sharpening. In Thebes, the great capital along the Nile, the call to war echoed through temples and barracks alike. Thutmos III had made his decision. He would not wait for Canaan to consolidate its rebellion. He would march swiftly and decisively, to remind the world why Egypt's name was spoken with reverence and fear. As orders flowed from the palace, the machine of empire stirred into motion. Across the land, garrisons mobilized. Messengers on horseback rode south to Nubia, east to the Red Sea, west into the Libyan frontier. Their words were brief but binding. Summon the soldiers, assemble the chariots, prepare the gods. The fields of Egypt had fed a kingdom for generations. Now, they would feed an army. From the deserts came seasoned camel riders, their skin darkened by the southern sun. From the Nile Delta came shipbuilders and scouts, craftsmen of wheels, bows, and arrow tips. Chariots, sleek and light, were pulled from storage and inspected for wear. Leather was tightened, bronze polished, and wheels tested on the temple courts of Memphis. In the war halls of Karnak, generals reviewed old maps and made new ones. Thutmos III himself oversaw every detail. This was no ceremonial command. He had trained for this moment his entire life, and he would lead not from behind but from the front. He reviewed the logistics personally: water supplies, food reserves, toolkits for repairs, siege materials, carpenters, healers, scribes. War, he knew, was won not only by sword or chariot, but by preparation and resolve. The Egyptian army was not a haphazard assembly of men. It was a living organism, built from experience, discipline, and divine order. Infantrymen carried curved khopesh blades, shields reinforced with leather and copper, and javelins for short-range combat. Archers marched with quivers on their backs and long bows nearly their height, their arms trained from childhood to draw and release in seamless rhythm. The charioteers, the elite of the force, drove two-horse vehicles with deadly grace. Each division had its name and its god. The Ammonius division, bearing the name of Egypt's chief deity, would fight with divine authority. The Ra division, like the sun, would strike without warning. The Ta division, named for the god of craftsmen, would build what the others destroyed. These were not merely units, they were embodiments of sacred purpose. And their commanders were not warlords, but loyal servants of Pharaoh. As the army gathered in Thebes, religious rituals filled the air. Priests burned incense and poured libations. Offerings were made to Ammonius Ra, and bulls were sacrificed in the courtyards of the temples. Thutmos stood barefoot before the gods, offering gold and prayer for victory. The The soldiers watched him, their belief unshaken. He was more than a man. He was the will of Egypt made flesh. With banners unfurled and horns sounding across the river, the great march began. Tens of thousands moved as one. Infantry in tight columns, chariots flanking them like lions on a hunt, engineers and support units trailing with carts and livestock. The path northward led them out of the familiar Nile Valley and into the edge of chaos. Every step brought them closer to the lands of rebellion. The roads were long and the terrain unforgiving. But the pharaoh's men moved with efficiency born of repetition. They had marched through deserts, swamps, and ravines in earlier campaigns. They knew when to stop, when to advance, and how to read the land like scripture. Scouts were sent ahead, not only to detect enemy movements but to map every oasis, every pass, every bend in the trail. They reached Gaza in good time, a fortified city that served as a gateway to Canaan. Its walls had once stood defiant, but now they opened willingly. The governor, still loyal to Egypt, welcomed the pharaoh's legions with open arms and open granaries. Supplies were replenished, the wounded treated, and most importantly, intelligence gathered. From Gaza's scribes came news of the enemy's movements, the defenses of Megiddo, and rumors of disunity among the rebel princes. From here, the march turned more cautious. The landscape of Canaan was deceptive. What looked like rolling hills could hide ambushes, and valleys could become death traps. Thutmos ordered his army to divide into multiple columns. Each column carried its own provisions and could fight independently if needed. The chariots were repositioned to guard against sudden attacks from higher ground. Daily routines became sacred rituals. Soldiers rose before dawn, ate rations of dried bread, onions, and beer, and packed their gear with practiced speed. Officers inspected formations. Priests led morning prayers. Each evening, tents were erected in geometric precision, with sentries posted on nearby ridges. Every night brought the possibility of conflict, and every dawn renewed their purpose. Canaanite scouts, watching from afar, were unnerved by what they saw. This was not the clumsy advance of a desperate empire. This was a serpent of bronze and fire, moving with silent intention. Their reports to Megiddo carried fear in every word. Egypt had come, not as a faltering overlord, but as a predator reclaiming its ground. Still, Thutmos III remained measured. He did not strike at the first signs of enemy presence. He allowed his army to build pressure like a rising tide, letting fear spread before swords were drawn. He wanted the Canaanite coalition to feel his approach before they ever saw his face. The campaign was not only about military victory, it was psychological warfare, and the pharaoh was its master. And so, day by day, the Egyptian army pushed deeper into contested lands. With every step, the memory of Hatshepsut's reign faded and the legend of Thutmos III grew. This was no longer a defensive expedition. It was a storm of divine order, descending upon a rebellious land that had forgotten its place beneath the sun of Egypt. Chapter 5: The Gamble of Aruna. The moment of choice came beneath the midday sun, in a tent heavy with maps, tension, and silence. Thutmos III stood before his generals, his hand tracing the roads of Canaan on a parchment worn from study. Before them lay 3 routes to Megiddo, each one a path not just through geography, but through fate. The decision would determine whether Egypt would ascend in glory or fall into disgrace. The first road wound wide to the north, a safer path that skirted danger but demanded time. It curved through open valleys where the army could march comfortably, where wagons rolled unhindered and ambushes were unlikely. But it would also give the coalition time to strengthen defenses, rally reinforcements, and prepare for a long siege. It was the cautious road, the road of delay. The second was gentler still, veering south then angling back up toward Megiddo. It was less arduous than the central path, but equally slow. The generals who favored this route spoke of preservation, of minimizing risk, of arriving with strength intact. But Thutmos III listened quietly, eyes unmoved, his gaze always returning to a thin, jagged line drawn directly between their camp and the fortress. That line marked the Aruna Pass. The Aruna route was no road at all. It was a narrow gorge flanked by steep cliffs, just wide enough for a single file of men and chariots. Any misstep, any ambush, could trap the army like fish in a stone net. It was suicide, some whispered. The Canaanite coalition surely had scouts there. They would expect no sane commander to risk such folly. And perhaps that was why Thutmos saw it as his key to victory. The pharaoh stood, his presence alone silencing the room. He spoke not of ease or comfort, but of speed, shock, and legacy. The coalition expected caution. They would watch the wider roads, prepare for a slow siege. But if the Egyptian army emerged suddenly from Aruna, they would be struck with terror before they could even form ranks. Thutmos wasn't gambling on luck. He was gambling on surprise, discipline, and divine favor. The order was given. Across the camp, murmurs rose among the soldiers as the plan spread. Some felt pride. This was the boldness of a warrior-pharaoh. Others feared disaster. But none questioned openly. For Thutmos had made it clear, he would ride at the front. If death awaited in the pass, he would meet it first. That was his promise, and it echoed through the ranks like a war drum. Preparations began immediately. The army reorganized for the narrow march. Chariots were stripped of excess weight, wheels reinforced, horses fed and watered for endurance. Infantry were ordered to carry only essential gear. Siege equipment was disassembled into lighter loads, and carpenters secured the wooden frames against the jostle of rocky ground. Scouts advanced ahead, checking every crevice for signs of the enemy. When dawn broke, the army moved like a river of bronze into the mouth of the pass. The air was heavy with silence. No birds sang among the rocks. The soldiers, trained for discipline, marched without speaking. At the head rode Thutmos III, his armor gleaming, his eyes fixed on the trail that twisted ahead like a serpent of stone. The pass was cruel. The rock faces rose like jaws on either side. In single file, men trudged forward, each step careful, each heartbeat loud. Chariots creaked, the wheels occasionally scraping cliff walls. Archers kept bows drawn, eyes scanning the high ridges. One rockfall, one cry from above, could trigger panic and destruction. But none came. Hours passed. Still no attack. The sun climbed, shadows shortened. Dust rose from 1,000 careful feet, coating the faces of men who dared not look up. The discipline held. The pharaoh's gamble so far was working. Somewhere in the distance, the horizon opened. The pass widened. The first scouts emerged into open country and saw nothing but fields swaying beneath a quiet sky. Relief rippled like a breeze through the column. They had done it. Thutmos III had rolled the dice, and they had landed in his favor. The Canaanite coalition had failed to guard the Aruna Pass, believing no sane army would dare such a path. They had planned to defend the wide roads, and now they were exposed. As the Egyptian soldiers emerged one by one into the open plain west of Megiddo, a strange energy surged through them. Not just relief, but triumph. They had survived the impossible. They had outwitted the enemy before a single arrow flew. The gods, they believed, walked with them. This was not just cleverness, it was divine will. In the coalition camps, the news hit like a thunderclap. Their scouts returned in panic, reporting Egyptian troops appearing like ghosts where none should be. The leaders, unprepared and divided, scrambled to react. Some accused their officers of treason. Others blamed the terrain. But it was too late. The trap they thought they'd set had not only failed, it had become their undoing. Thutmos wasted no time. He ordered the army to establish camp swiftly, using the elevated ground to their advantage. Scouts were sent to watch the city, and engineers began unpacking the siege materials. Patrols ensured the roads behind remained secure. The Egyptians had gained not only position but initiative. For the men of Egypt, The march through Aruna would become legend, a tale of daring that would be carved into temple walls and whispered in the barracks for generations. And for Thutmos III, it was only the beginning. Megiddo still stood, but it now stood exposed, unready, and already afraid. The storm was no longer coming. It had arrived. Chapter 6. The fortress awaits. The plains outside Megiddo stretched like a calm before a storm. The Egyptian army, weary from the treacherous march through Aruna, now stood in open sight of the greatest fortress in Canaan. Megiddo rose like a crown of earth and stone, its high walls defiant, its watchtowers manned, its gates closed tight. But inside those walls, the coalition was already unraveling. The very thing that gave the rebels confidence, the strength of their citadel, had become their prison. Thutmos III wasted no time savoring the success of his gamble. Speed had delivered him to the doorstep of his enemy, but only preparation would tear that door down. He ordered the immediate establishment of a fortified base camp just southwest of the city. The terrain was carefully selected, close enough to observe enemy movements, elevated enough to repel attacks, and near vital water sources to sustain a siege. The pharaoh was not content with a victory of movement. He had come for absolute control. Within hours, the Egyptian camp emerged like a city of war. Canvas tents rose in formation, supply wagons were arranged into defensive perimeters, and chariots were parked in rotating shifts, ready to strike if needed. Infantry took turns guarding the outer ring while engineers dug trenches and erected palisades. The scent of oil, sweat, and anticipation thickened the air. Everyone knew a siege was coming. No one knew when the first arrow would fly. Inside the command tent, Thutmos gathered his officers beneath flickering torches. Reports came in from scouts, no reinforcements in sight, but the Canaanite coalition was mustering inside Megiddo's walls. Their numbers remained unclear. What was clear, however, was their confusion. They had been caught unprepared. Their forces were still scattered, their command fractured. Some had been expecting a delayed arrival. Others had not believed the Egyptians would dare to cross Aruna. Now that disbelief was costing them dearly. Yet despite their disarray, the coalition was not helpless. Their fortress was no ordinary stronghold. Megiddo's walls were thick, its gates iron-bolted. Its elevated position made direct assault perilous. Archers could fire from height, and its storerooms had been stocked in anticipation of conflict. If given time, the rebels could fortify themselves and even rally external support. Thutmos understood this well. His campaign's success depended on denying them both. The pharaoh imposed a strict defensive perimeter. Egyptian patrols swept the surrounding hills to intercept messengers or fleeing soldiers. The local roads, once arteries of trade, became veins of isolation. No food would come, no messages would go, and the longer Megiddo waited, the weaker it would grow. The siege had not yet begun, but the city was already under pressure. Some among the Canaanite ranks urged immediate diplomacy. Surely Egypt would accept surrender if it spared bloodshed. But their leaders, the kings of Kadesh, Hazor, and other rebellious city-states, knew better. They had pushed too far, broken too many oaths. There would be no generous terms. To surrender now was to face humiliation, if not death. Their only chance was to hold and hope that Egypt would falter. Meanwhile, Thutmos strengthened his psychological grip. At night, campfires dotted the hills surrounding Megiddo. Visible from the walls, symbols of encirclement. In the day, chariots paraded in full armor just out of arrow range, their gold-trimmed banners fluttering in the breeze. Every move was calculated to sap morale, to remind the rebels that Egypt had not just returned, it had ascended. As preparations intensified, the Egyptians remained vigilant. Thutmos knew the city might attempt a sudden counterattack or breakout. Scouts were placed at every possible exit. Even local shepherds and farmers were interrogated, their knowledge of the terrain used to plug potential escape routes. The pharaoh left nothing to chance. His strategy was not only to defeat the enemy, but to leave no space for resistance to rise again. Still, the siege was not without risk. Provisions had to last. Discipline had to hold. Morale had to remain unbroken. Thutmos rotated units between patrol and rest. Priests conducted daily rituals, invoking the blessings of Ammonius and Ra, reminding the troops that their mission was sacred. Scribes chronicled each development for the record, not just for strategy but for history. Thutmos knew he was crafting a legend. And so, a strange stillness settled over the valley. The two sides stared at one another across the field, one behind walls of stone, the other behind walls of will. From atop Megiddo, Canaanite archers watched the Egyptian camp grow with each sunrise. From the Egyptian heights, commanders studied the gates for weaknesses. Neither side moved. Both sides waited. Within the walls, tension brewed. Some soldiers began to question their leaders. Why had they not defended Aruna? Why had reinforcements not arrived? And most troubling, how long could they last with no aid from the north? Doubts crept like cracks in the foundation, small at first, but dangerous with time. Yet defiance still lived. On the ramparts, Canaanite flags waved. Drums echoed through the narrow streets of the fortress. Children were hidden underground. Weapons were sharpened. The city was afraid, but it was not broken. Not yet. And in the heart of the Egyptian camp, Thutmos III stood beneath the night sky, eyes fixed on the looming shadow of Megiddo. He felt no hesitation. He would wait as long as it took, strike only when it counted, and show the world that a pharaoh does not beg for victory. He demands it and takes it. Chapter 7, Clashing Titans. When the clash finally came, it arrived not like a thunderclap, but like the slow tightening of a bowstring. The air around Megiddo seemed to thicken with tension. The days of silence had stretched thin, and neither side could afford to wait much longer. The Canaanite coalition, restless behind the walls, knew the siege would only grow tighter, and Thutmos III, patient but calculating, knew he could not allow the enemy to recover its footing. The time had come to strike, not blindly, but with orchestration, with precision, and with overwhelming force. The Egyptian army prepared as a living organism. Its divisions, named after gods, moved with sacred intent. The division of Ammonius would take the center, a hammer blow directed at the rebel heart. The division of Ra, radiant and fierce, would move on the right flank. The division of Ta, grounded and methodical, would flank from the left. Each contingent was a carefully measured blade in Thutmos's hand. And behind them all, his chariots waited like lightning coiled in a storm. Megiddo's defenders saw the movement and scrambled. Their coalition, formed in haste and sealed by fear, now faced the storm it had hoped to avoid. From its walls, the archers readied volleys. Spears were distributed to untrained hands. The commanders, torn between cities and loyalties, attempted to form a unified response, but cohesion was brittle. Trust was scarce, and time had run out. The Egyptians struck first with silence. Then came the horn calls, deep and reverberating like the voices of gods. And then a hail of arrows. Thousands launched in coordinated waves, darkening the sky, falling in deadly arcs on the outer defenses. From elevated platforms, Egyptian archers kept rhythm, reloading and releasing with terrifying speed. The Canaanite defenders, taken off guard, scrambled for cover as the first bodies fell. And then came the sound of hooves. Chariots surged forward, wheels slicing the earth, dust billowing behind them like smoke from a divine forge. Thutmos's war wagons were lighter and faster than their Canaanite counterparts, designed for maneuverability. Armed with archers, spearmen, and drivers trained to perfection, they crashed into enemy lines with merciless precision. Each chariot moved not as a weapon but as a unit, a mobile temple of death. The field outside Megiddo descended into chaos. The coalition, surprised by the rapidity and intensity of the Egyptian assault, tried to counter with their own chariots. But theirs were slower, heavier, and less coordinated. What was meant to be a shield wall became a patchwork of resistance, breaking under the pressure. In moments, what had been preparation turned to panic. Thutmos III rode into the fray, not from a distance, but with the front ranks, his golden chariot gleaming in the sun. His presence was more than symbolic, it was catalytic. Soldiers surged forward with renewed energy, chanting his name, invoking the gods, charging alongside a king who did not ask for courage, but embodied it. Where he rode, the lines held. Where he pointed, the enemy fled. Yet the battle was not without resistance. On the flanks, Canaanite archers had stationed themselves on ridges, launching arrows at the Egyptian chariots from above. The flanking fire disrupted formation, forcing the Egyptians to adjust mid-charge. Thutmos ordered his own archers to suppress them. A smaller detachment was sent to the high ground, scaling the rocky outcrops under cover of shield walls. Within minutes, the ridges were cleared, the Canaanite sharpshooters silenced. Infantry clashed in the open field. Bronze struck bronze. Swords met shields. Men grappled in the dust while war cries drowned in the clamor. But Egyptian discipline prevailed. Trained to fight in formation, shielded by coordination, their ranks did not break. The Canaanite forces, though brave, lacked unified command. One by one, their lines buckled under pressure. On the left, the division of Ta advanced, pushing enemy forces toward a narrow defile near the base of the city. Cut off from retreat, dozens of Canaanite fighters dropped their weapons, raising hands in surrender. On the right, the division of Ra curved inward like a scythe, flanking the city gates. The rebels, recognizing the trap, attempted a desperate push to fall back behind the safety of the walls. But it was too late. The retreat turned into a stampede. The slope leading up to Megiddo's main gate became a funnel of chaos. Horses fell, men trampled one another, weapons were discarded. The defenders within the city, fearing Egyptian pursuit, shut the gates prematurely, locking out their own. A tragic miscalculation. Outside, hundreds were caught between enemy blades and their own stone walls. Egyptian archers took their final toll in those moments. Arrows rained on the exposed soldiers below the ramparts, while chariots rounded the edges to block any escape. It was not a battle anymore, it was a rout. What remained of the coalition's field army was either captured, slain, or trapped. As the dust settled and the last cries of combat faded, the field fell quiet. Bodies lay strewn across the earth, a grim mosaic of rebellion and consequence. Thutmos III stood at the edge of the city's shadow, victorious not only in combat, but in strategy, presence, and command. He had not only beaten an army, he had broken a rebellion. Megiddo's gates remained closed, its walls now silent. But Thutmos did not order an assault. He knew better. The fortress was cornered, its spirit wounded. The city would not fall by force. It would fall by fear, by hunger, and by the inevitability of its ruler's will. The battle was over. The siege had begun. Chapter 8. The Gates of Despair. The smoke of battle still lingered in the air when the survivors rushed the gates. Dirt-streaked, bloodied, and breathless, the remnants of the Canaanite field army pounded on the great wooden doors of Megiddo, shouting for mercy from their own people. But the cries were drowned by fear. Inside the city, the commanders hesitated. If they opened the gates now, the Egyptian chariots might follow. If they kept them shut, their comrades would die. Fear won. The gates groaned closed with a finality that echoed like betrayal. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of soldiers, wounded, desperate, were stranded outside. Many turned to face the advancing Egyptians. Some raised their arms in surrender. Others, refusing to yield, lifted spears for a final stand. The Egyptians, methodical and merciless, swept them aside. The fields of Megiddo became a graveyard before the sun had fully set. From atop the city walls, The citizens watched in stunned silence. What had begun as a war of pride and promise now looked like ruin. The streets below were tense. Whispers slithered through alleyways. Would Egypt burn the city to the ground? Would Thutmos take revenge for every insult, every withheld tribute, every rebellious treaty signed in secret? Behind the high stone walls, Canaan's coalition leaders began to fracture. Thutmos III did not press the advantage with immediate force. He did not need to. The rebellion had already been gutted in the field. What remained inside Megiddo's walls was fear, and the pharaoh knew how to let it grow. He ordered his forces to encircle the fortress completely. No soul would enter. No food would leave. He would starve them of hope before lifting a single siege ladder. The Egyptian army moved quickly. Camps were established at all major routes, with sentries posted along every rise and road. Engineers were tasked with digging trenches and raising earthworks to control the land around the city. High watchtowers were constructed to keep constant surveillance over the walls. No movement went unnoticed. Even the birds seemed to fly under suspicion. Within Megiddo, desperation began its slow invasion. Supplies had been stored, but not for a siege this swift. The speed of Egypt's arrival had caught everyone off guard. And with the outer defenders dead or captured, there would be no second army, no cavalry from Kadesh or reinforcements from Mitanni. They were alone now, and the pharaoh was patient. At night, the sounds of Egyptian drums pulsed like distant thunder. Patrols moved in shifting formations, their torches flickering beyond the walls like spirits of judgment. Every day the presence grew heavier. Egyptian chariots circled the base of the hill, not to attack, but to remind the city of what waited just beyond its gate. Siege towers were seen rising in the distance. Ladders appeared in stacks. The noose was tightening. The coalition leaders met in candlelit rooms, arguing in hushed voices. Some urged negotiation, but none dared open the gate. Others demanded a breakout attempt, madness in the face of such order and coordination. And then there were the zealots, those who spoke of dying with honor, turning the city into a last stand. But the people, the common folk, the farmers and artisans who had trusted their rulers, they simply wanted to live. Inside the city, bread was rationed. Water, once drawn freely from cisterns and springs, began to grow scarce. Disease crept through the tightly packed quarters. Children wept quietly at night, and the walls, once symbols of strength, now felt like prison bars. Above it all, the sun rose and set without pity. The siege did not scream, it suffocated. Thutmos III remained in control. Each day he convened with his officers and priests. Reports from surrounding regions arrived, small towns pledging loyalty again, offering tribute and hostages to avoid Megiddo's fate. Egypt's influence, like its army, expanded without resistance. The pharaoh had transformed the siege into a living message. Defiance was not only punished, it was erased. Still, the city did not surrender. Not yet. Pride lingered like embers beneath the ash. The rulers of Megiddo had made grand declarations. They had called Egypt weak. To yield now would be to expose their vanity, their failure. And so they endured, hoping for a miracle that would never come. From time to time, small groups attempted to sneak out. Through hidden tunnels, under cover of night, desperate individuals fled the city to seek help or deliver word. Most were caught by Egyptian patrols. The few who escaped brought only despair. There was no one coming. No allies left. No gods to save them. And yet, Thutmos held back his final blow. He allowed the siege to fester, because he understood its true power. Each day that passed was a weight upon Megiddo's spirit. The longer the city suffered without being stormed, the more its people would turn on their leaders. Let them suffer from within. Let the surrender come from desperation, not fear. That, to Thutmos, was conquest without a sword. In time, even the proudest voices grew quiet. The coalition council stopped meeting. The palace grew still. The market square emptied. And in the homes of Megiddo, the people stared at walls they once believed would protect them. Now they were waiting for either salvation or surrender. And in the hills beyond the walls the pharaoh waited too, cloaked not in armor, but in certainty. For he knew, even before the gates opened, that Megiddo had already fallen. Chapter 9. Siege and Starvation. Days bled into weeks, and the walls of Megiddo stood still, but the life behind them began to unravel. What had once been a proud, defiant city was now a cage of hunger and whispering shadows. The siege, as designed by Thutmos III, was not merely a military operation. It was a slow suffocation of morale, a deliberate collapse from within. There were no grand assaults, no battering rams crashing through the gates, only the relentless tightening of silence. Inside the fortress, every breath became a calculation. Grain stores, once symbols of preparedness, dwindled quickly. The siege had come too swiftly, too cunningly. The rebel princes had prepared for resistance, not starvation. Rations were cut. Bread grew thinner. The pulse of the city slowed. Even water, once abundant in the cisterns and stone-lined reservoirs, became tainted with the taste of decay. Disease crept in with invisible feet. The crowded conditions, the unwashed bodies, the weakening immune systems, all conspired to birth sickness. Children developed fevers. Old men coughed blood. The smell of sickness, like rotting straw and sweat, began to haunt the inner courtyards. Priests chanted rituals for protection, but even the gods seemed to avert their eyes. And still Thutmos did not attack. He watched from his high encampment as the city fell into shadow. Scouts returned with reports. The cries at night, the fires burning fewer and fewer in the courtyards, the silence thickening. The Egyptian camp, by contrast, hummed with discipline. Soldiers trained daily, ate warm meals, sharpened blades. Fresh supplies came from coastal ports and loyal towns. The contrast was not accidental, it was psychological warfare perfected. Outside the city walls, Egyptian engineers continued to encircle Megiddo with a tightening ring of control. Observation towers rose like wooden teeth. Ditches were dug to prevent sorties. Patrols moved in shifting patterns, guarding every road and slope. Siege ladders and rams were built, not for immediate use but as looming threats. A visible reminder that the city's time was measured in breath, not brick. Inside, the coalition leaders found themselves isolated even from one another. Blame became currency. The king of Kadesh accused the nobles of Megiddo of cowardice. Other princes suggested betrayal. The unity they had once forged through fear of Egypt now splintered under pressure. They no longer fought Thutmos, they fought doubt. In the homes of Megiddo, hunger turned to desperation. Pets disappeared. Bark was stripped from trees. In the darkest corners, rumors began to spread. Of meat that came from unspoken sources, of neighbors who vanished in the night. Mothers wrapped their children in cloth not for warmth, but to keep them from hearing the arguments over food. Some residents pleaded with the rebel leaders to open the gates. Better to live as Egyptians than to die in filth, they whispered. But the leaders, too proud or too afraid, refused. They feared not just Thutmos's army, but his justice. They had broken treaties, incited war, and killed governors. Surrender might not mean mercy, and still the pharaoh waited. He knew the psychology of siege better than most generals. A swift conquest brought scars, but a slow one brought submission. He didn't want Megiddo to fall in flame. He wanted it to bend, to crack, to offer itself in fear and reverence. A shattered rebellion was one thing. A kneeling city was empire. Thutmos used the time to expand his influence further. Ambassadors from nearby cities arrived in his camp with gifts and apologies. "We were never part of the revolt," they claimed, though their silence during its rise had said otherwise. Thutmos accepted their offerings but took hostages from noble families, sons and daughters who would live in Egypt as insurance against future defiance. These months of siege, while harsh for Megiddo, were golden for Egyptian diplomacy. The campaign became not only a military conquest but a public lesson. Egypt was not just powerful, it was inevitable. Town by town, region by region, the Near East shifted back into Pharaoh's embrace. Inside Megiddo, the last reserves were broken. Fires dwindled. Markets were shuttered. The streets became hollow canyons of silence. Armed guards still roamed, but their armor hung looser on shrinking bodies. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths tight with pain. Rebellion had become starvation. And then, one day, the first white cloth appeared atop the wall. A flag of surrender, small, hesitant, but unmistakable. A gesture of desperation. Inside, arguments raged. Some still clung to pride, others to fear. But most simply wanted it to end. Thutmos had not attacked. He had not burned the gates. He had waited, and Megiddo had devoured itself. The pharaoh watched the cloth sway in the wind, said nothing for a time, then ordered his officers to prepare. Not for battle, but for entry. The city would be taken not with fire, but with footsteps. He would walk into Megiddo as a god reclaims a temple. And far within the city walls, among the dust and the hunger, the people of Megiddo bowed their heads, some in relief, others in shame, awaiting the arrival of a conqueror they no longer dared defy. Chapter 10. The Fall of Megiddo. The gates of Megiddo creaked open not with the force of rams or fire, but with the weight of despair. Hinges once built to withstand battering were now undone by starvation. Dust rose as the massive doors parted, revealing a city bent, not broken by silence. The people, gaunt and ghost-like, lined the inner streets. They made no sound. They did not resist. They simply watched as the shadow of Thutmos III crossed their threshold. The pharaoh did not rush. He moved with ritual. Ahead of him, standard-bearers marched with the banners of Ammonius, Ra, and Ta fluttering in the breeze. Behind them, the royal guard, bronze-clad and silent, flanked the procession like pillars of fate. And in the center rode Thutmos himself, head high, eyes forward, not as a warlord, but as destiny incarnate. For Megiddo, this was not defeat. It was judgment. The streets were cleared by Egyptian troops. Civilians were ordered to remain in their homes. The rebel princes, those who had not fled or died, were rounded up by officers and placed under watch. The people of the city watched from behind shutters and doorways, staring at the face of a man who had brought an empire across mountains and deserts to stand at their doorstep, and had not flinched. Thutmos dismounted at the city's central square, where once the coalition leaders had plotted rebellion. Now, the stone platform that served as their council hall became the pharaoh's pulpit. Here, beneath the gaze of frightened notables and broken soldiers, he declared the restoration of Mot, the divine order Egypt claimed to uphold. Megiddo would not be razed, but it would never forget. The pharaoh's victory was not just measured in prisoners or spoils, it was measured in submission. He did not reduce the city to ashes because he no longer needed to. The memory of hunger, of abandonment, of fear, these were deeper scars than any fire could etch. A conquered people can rebuild, but a shamed people remember. Orders were given with precision. The city's granaries were inventoried, its weapons confiscated. Horses and chariots were seized and redirected to Egyptian camps. Gold and silver, found in the treasuries of the coalition lords, were taken, meticulously recorded by scribes who etched every detail into tablets destined for temples in Thebes. This was not pillaging. It was policy. Prisoners were separated. The common soldiers, thin and sick, were given food and detained. The leaders, the princes who had dared defy Pharaoh, were brought forward in chains. Some begged. Others stood silent. A few wept. Thutmos looked upon them not with anger, but with purpose. These were not enemies. They were examples. Most would be sent to Egypt, not as slaves but as trophies. Paraded in triumph, they would serve to remind other rulers what came of rebellion. Some would be re-educated in Egyptian courts, held as guests under constant watch. Others, deemed irredeemable, would vanish into silence. Their names struck from tablets, their bloodlines extinguished in shame. But one punishment was universal. Every rebel prince was forced to send a family member, often a son or daughter, as a hostage to Egypt. These children would be raised in the halls of Thebes, dressed in Egyptian linen, taught the language of their conquerors, and reminded every day that their future rested in obedience. It was not cruelty, it was control. As the days passed, the Egyptian army transformed Megiddo into a new outpost. Garrison troops were installed, administrative quarters established. Egyptian engineers repaired roads leading to the city, ensuring it would serve not as a fortress of resistance, but as a node of empire. The city would live, but it would speak with an Egyptian tongue. The surrounding cities, seeing Megiddo fall, sent messengers bearing gifts and apologies. "We never supported the rebellion," they claimed. "Our loyalty was always with Pharaoh." Thutmos accepted their tribute and their fear. Canaan was now in his hands not just by conquest, but by consensus. No more coalitions would rise. The lesson had been etched into stone. As for the people of Megiddo, life slowly resumed. Markets reopened. The sick were treated. But the memory of the siege clung to every wall like soot. The pharaoh's mercy, though real, was wrapped in the scent of ashes. Megiddo had survived, but it would never again dare to defy the voice that rose from the Nile. Thutmos III returned to his camp with the banners of victory trailing behind him. He had not just won a battle, he had defined a generation. The campaign was far from over, but the greatest obstacle had fallen. He would march further, yes, but in that moment, beneath the sun that now seemed to shine only for Egypt, the world paused to acknowledge one truth. The gods had chosen their conqueror, and his name was Thutmos. Chapter 11, Empire Forged in Iron and Fire. With Megiddo subdued and its gates now a corridor for Egyptian banners, Thutmos III stood not just as a victorious king, but as a symbol of imperial transformation. The battle had ended, but what followed was perhaps more important than conquest. Consolidation. Empire, after all, is not built by the sword alone. It is etched into memory by law, loyalty, and legacy. From the ashes of rebellion, a new order took root. Thutmos wasted no time in restructuring Canaan's political landscape. The defiant princes were no longer allowed to govern themselves unchecked. In their place, Egyptian-appointed governors assumed control, men trained in Thebes, loyal not to local interests, but to the will of Pharaoh. These were not merely overseers. They were the Pharaoh's voice in foreign lands. Each city that had participated in the rebellion was brought under close supervision. Taxation systems were standardized. Egyptian scribes arrived with papyrus scrolls and red ink, recording every bushel of grain, every cart of timber, every talent of silver. It was bureaucracy with a divine mandate, order imposed on chaos, civilization reshaped to the rhythm of the Nile. To secure this influence, Thutmos established garrisons along major trade routes. Fortresses were built or repurposed. Roads were repaired and widened. Patrols ensured that the highways of the Near East no longer carried rebellion. They carried tribute. Megiddo, once a symbol of defiance, was transformed into an imperial hub. It became not just a city under occupation, but an axis of Egyptian control in the northern Levant. But Thutmos was not merely a conqueror, he was a strategist. Where force ended, diplomacy began. The princes who remained were offered conditional clemency. Rule your lands, pay your taxes, and send your sons to Egypt. These hostages became a generation of reluctant ambassadors, raised in the shadow of Karnak, trained to love what their fathers had feared. These sons, raised in Egyptian palaces, became the next phase of empire. They were dressed in linen, trained in the Egyptian language, taught the myths of Ra and Ammonius. Some would grow to admire Egypt's strength. Others would quietly dream of home. but all would remember who held the reins of power and why. The empire of Thutmos was not merely a political construct. It was a cultural tide that washed over the lands it touched. Back in Thebes, news of the victory spread like floodwater. Temples rang with praise. Priests proclaimed that Ammonius had extended his divine reach. Artists began carving steel and painting murals depicting the pharaoh's triumph. Not in carnage, but in grandeur. Columns showed him smiting the enemies of Egypt, while subdued kings knelt before him, hands raised in submission. These were not just decorations. They were lessons for the ages. The loot from Megiddo and the surrounding cities filled Egypt's treasuries. Horses, finely bred and trained, were redirected to chariot divisions. Gold and silver ingots were melted down for temples and state projects. Exquisite pottery, jewelry, and rare textiles were displayed in royal courts as testaments to Egyptian dominance and to the futility of rebellion. But wealth alone was not enough. Thutmos invested in legacy. He commissioned new temples and expanded old ones. In the halls of Karnak, he ordered inscriptions recounting the siege of Megiddo in great detail, not merely to boast, but to ensure that future pharaohs would remember how empires are secured not only with arrows, but with patience, discipline, and resolve. Foreign rulers, too, took notice. From Mitanni to Babylonia, word of Megiddo's fall sent a clear message. Egypt had risen. Some responded with caution, others with curiosity. In time, emissaries arrived with offerings, gifts, and even daughters, women sent to marry into the Egyptian court and secure diplomatic ties. The empire was expanding not only through land, but through blood and alliance. Thus began a new phase of Egyptian rule, a golden age of expansion and influence. Thutmos III, once a shadowed prince under Hatshepsut's regency, had become something more than pharaoh. He had become an institution. The lands of Canaan were no longer contested terrain. They were provinces in a divine dominion, monitored by scribes, guarded by soldiers, and watched from afar by a ruler who had proven his right to command. The empire stretched further than it ever had before, past the shores of the Levant into the mountains of Syria and across the deserts of Nubia. It was a network of power built on the twin pillars of fear and respect. And at its heart stood a man who had crossed Aruna, conquered Megiddo, and remade the world in his image. But for Thutmos, it was not enough to win. He wanted to endure. The empire he forged in iron and fire was not merely for his reign. It was to echo across centuries. His name would not fade like those of petty kings and minor lords. It would be carved into stone, sung in hymns, and whispered in the shadows of every city that had once dared to resist. And so, with the land at peace, the rivers of tribute flowing, and his enemies either kneeling or vanished, Thutmos III looked toward the horizon, not as a man, but as a monument in motion. Chapter 12. Legacy of a Conqueror. History remembers kings. It builds statues for some, writes cautionary tales for others, and forgets most entirely. But Thutmos III, the pharaoh who crossed the Aruna Pass, broke the spine of rebellion at Megiddo, and carved empire into the bones of nations. He did not fade. His story, unlike so many, was not simply recorded. It was preserved like scripture, and it began to echo across lands far beyond the Nile. In the halls of Karnak, his victories were etched in stone, not just for glory, but for education. Future rulers would walk those columns and see, line by line, how empire was built. Not in blind fury, but with precision, strategy, and unshakable will. The siege of Megiddo became the prototype for every campaign that followed. Generals studied it, scribes retold it, and empires, later and lesser, tried to mimic it. But Thutmos's legacy was not confined to military triumphs. He reshaped the very concept of kingship. No longer was Pharaoh simply the protector of Egypt. Now, Pharaoh was lord of lands beyond, speaker of many tongues, master of foreign princes, and architect of a world order built from obedience and awe. Egypt was no longer a valley-bound kingdom. It was the beating heart of an international system. The tribute from Canaan alone redefined Egypt's economy. With roads secured and rebellion crushed, trade flourished. Gold flowed from the Levant, incense from Arabia, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Horses, once rare and foreign, now bred in Egyptian stables. The chariot, once an imported marvel, became a native symbol of power. Thutmose didn't just take what was valuable, he integrated it, made it Egyptian. He also elevated diplomacy to an imperial tool. Where once war had spoken for Egypt, now envoys carried its message. Foreign kings, aware of Megiddo's fate, sent messages of peace and daughters of noble birth. Marriages became treaties. Gifts became tributes. Egypt under Thutmose didn't just conquer, it absorbed. His influence reached as far as the Euphrates. And though he never declared himself ruler of all, the kings of Mitanni, Babylon, and even the Hittites watched him with caution. He had become more than a rival, he was the measure of power. To challenge him was to risk the same slow, smothering defeat Megiddo had endured. Few dared. Yet within Egypt itself, Thutmose ruled with balance. He expanded temples, strengthened priesthoods, and allowed cities like Memphis, Heliopolis, and Thebes to flourish under his protection. He understood that empire was not just taken with force, it was held with faith. He gave offerings to the gods, built monuments that touched the sky, and honored the dead with ceremonies fit for gods. As the years passed, he continued to campaign, not out of lust for war, but to ensure stability. Like a gardener pruning the outermost branches, he moved against rebellion quickly, decisively, never allowing seeds of defiance to take root again. His army was lean, efficient, and loyal. His officers were drawn from those who had proven themselves in the fire of Megiddo. His government was layered, organized, and deeply respected. When he died, around the age of 56, he left behind more than tombs and temples. He left behind a blueprint. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings, carved into the cliffs of Thebes, carried inscriptions that spoke not only of his birthright, but of his deeds. He was not buried as a man, but as an epic. The age of Thutmose was one of transformation, and the world remembered. Later historians, including those in the classical and medieval world, would look back on the Battle of Megiddo as the first truly documented war campaign in recorded history. Not merely for its scale, but for its structure. The letters, the steels, the temple reliefs, they were the record keepers of a mind that understood the importance of posterity. Thutmose did not just win. He made sure his victory endured. Modern Egyptologists have sometimes called him the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, not because he shared the same ambition, but because he combined vision with execution. He wasn't merely victorious, he was meticulous. He wasn't merely feared, he was revered. But unlike many conquerors, Thutmose did not leave ruin in his wake. He left order, stability, a system that would last in various forms for generations. He did not need to build walls around Egypt. He built respect beyond them. And so, the name Thutmose III passed from temple to tablet, from dynasty to dynasty, from scholar to student. He became more than a chapter in Egypt's story. He became a keystone, a pivot upon which the idea of Egyptian greatness turned. And in the windswept fields outside a now quiet Megiddo, the ghosts of war still whisper his name, not in mourning but in awe. For they remember the pharaoh who did not just conquer cities but time itself.